Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending where you are. Welcome to the session on digital currency validation for protection and resilience. My name is Vijay Mauree, and I lead the Digital Currency Global Initiative Secretariat in the Standardization Bureau at ITU. This is our last session for the security thematic track and also for the DC³ conference, which is organized by the ITU in collaboration with the Future of Digital Currency initiative of Stanford University as part of the activities of the Digital Currency Global Initiative. I'm joined today by our panelists. Let me introduce them. Mr. Jacques Francoeur, Chief Scientist, CNOW, and also team leader of the Security and Assurance Working Group of the Digital Currency Global Initiative, and Mr. Ed Scheidt, who is the convener of ISO TC68 SC2 Working Group 17 on security of digital currencies. So this session today will discuss the process for a common multi-level assurance that can be applied to all digital currency types for threat analysis and security protection design and assurance. So basically this session today, it follows a bit, the session that was held in the morning where we discussed the digital currency ontology notions. And just before this one, we were talking about the different security threats to digital currencies. And now we are going to discuss, a multi-level assurance process that can be applied, for threat analysis and security protection design as well. So the presentation today will consist of 7 parts. And after each part, we'll have a discussion. So audience can submit questions on the Q&A as during the presentations, and we'll take them at the end of each part. And Mr. Ed Scheidt from ISO will intervene after each part to give his, on his side, what are the actions that ISO is doing on these different aspects of the security evaluation model. So the presentation will be led by Mr. Jacques Francoeur, and I'm now going to invite him to take the floor for his presentation. And just as a reminder, Jacques, you have, for each part of your presentation, you have 12 minutes. And after the 12 minutes, we'll have the discussion with uh, Ed, and then you will resume the next part afterwards, okay?
Understood.
So
Can you
Jacques,
see
you
that?
have the floor now.
Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you see the slides?
Yes, I can see you and I can also see the slides. So I think you're
Beautiful.
good to go. If you can go in presentation mode.
Well, thank you, Vijay, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for your precious time to listen to what we have to say. My name is Jacques Francoeur. As Vijay indicated, we have a very special guest, Ed Scheidt, on this session, who will add his valuable insight onto this issue of validation and the topic of assurance. It's interesting to take a few minutes to get to know Ed, to see some of the things he's been involved in his life. And here we have a very special crypto sculpture that is located on the CIA headquarters in Langley. It's 4 parts, 1,800 letters. And the first 3 parts have been solved, but the 4th has not, being considered one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in the world. So Ed, here, I just want to take a moment to explain this story. It's sort of quite interesting. In '98, the artist explored potential themes and decided to incorporate some encrypted messages into the art. Sanborn, the artist, was new to encryption, so they enlisted Ed's help, who was in the process of retiring. And at the time, Webster referred to Ed as deep throat of codes. And then after, some serious discussions, Scheidt taught the artist various encryption methods. And then Sandborg, the artist himself, chose the actual message text. Of the message on the sculpture, 3 have been solved, as I mentioned. The 4th characters at the very bottom there remain uncracked. Ed knows the answer, along with the artist and probably somebody else at the CIA. So in 98, Stein took 400 hours over his lunch period to decipher the first 3 parts using a pencil and pen. And then a year later, a California computer scientist boasted to have solved the first 3 sections using a Pentium 2. And then the 4th code, seemingly insurmountable, seemed to crack to start a race to break the first 3 codes, of course, maybe even the 4th, given it was shown to be breakable. But Ed, there's a rumor that, Stein or Gilligy weren't even the first ones to do it, that the NSA had beaten them in breaking the first 3 codes before. Is that true? Can you clarify that on the record? No?
I'll pass on that.
All right, thank you. Well, that's Ed. So we have a very special person with us who has now brought his brilliance to the domain of digital currency security. So we're very lucky to have you, Ed. I'm just quickly going to go through and outline the Security and Assurance Working Group. We have Mitch Cohen from eCurrency, focused on building a CBDC target, model threat countermeasures, kind of the thing that we do. But you notice here that we start with a model of the thing that we need to protect. We have the pure cryptocurrency version of that as a target model, being led by Jason Lau of Crypto.com. And we also have Paul Lloyd of HP Enterprise, who is focused on quantum safe cryptographic processes that will feed the needs of all digital currency type systems. So that's really truly horizontal through all the different types of currencies that will need that kind of support. Myself as the team lead, I lead the validation work stream, and here Ed is the liaison with the working group. So again, very fortunate to have that. So what is the Security and Assurance Working Group, and in particular the validation work stream, trying to achieve? We're trying to develop a flexible, objective, framework agnostic, multi-assurance, formal method based. That's a lot of words. But each one of them is critical. And I'll get to how we meet flexibility, objectivity, being agnostic. And by that, I mean, pick any framework you want, as opposed to being somehow locked in by one framework versus another. Now, a validation process. So validation, first of all, is a process and a platform to do it in, because what is essential is that this process be easy to do the work that needs to be done. Using current approaches would be very difficult to achieve these new outcomes. So what is the process? What is the platform that will enable that? It will enable the automation or the facilitation of a common basis evaluation and benchmarking of different performance characteristics, whether it be resilience or security or privacy, or even performance, things like scalability, so that you could evaluate and compare the performance of these across digital currency type systems. So it's a lot of desire. You see here the sense of normalization. We want to be able to compare across different systems with confidence. Let me take a moment to explain the process that DCGI is following in its validation model. It brings together a global domain of experts who propose suitable specifications as input into this standardization process. Now, DCGI is like a focus group. It's an early stage standardization process, and then there are the more formal where the standards are actually produced, and standards at ITU are called recommendations, but those occur in study groups, which is an entirely different process that we won't necessarily go into right now, but we bring together all these experts. We do so by consensus, and we're supposed to output whatever is created into this validation engine. And so what we're trying to do is ensure common, consistent, comparable. Whatever it is we're doing, we're trying to make sure by design up front, common, consistent, comparable, in this case, specifications, measurements and metrics and templates and evaluations, so that we can have a reliable and repeatable process, so that we can compare things and have confidence in the outcome of the comparison, and that you can compare two things on a common basis. And then we feed that back into the consensus, and it feeds continues in a feedback loop. So we want common specifications and requirements, consistent measurement metrics and metrics, or measurement methods and metrics, comparable models and templates and evaluation, all with the goal of standardizing the DC type. And you'll see later a reference to other work from the other working groups that feeds into the ability to standardize DC types, with the objective of standardizing, again, the models, the measurements, the evaluation, and even a tool that will ensure, again, that repeatability with high confidence of performance or protection metrics, so that we can assess and benchmark across ecosystems. So that is, again, a bit of a restatement, but basically we want a world that, in essence, takes a lot of knowledge dispersed and fragmented and brings it into a standardized format that can help everyone achieve a better outcome. So one thing that was critical in DCGI, from my point of view at least, is that we all attempted to understand the DC type and then consider various things, whatever, in relation to a DC type that we're all agreeing that we're talking about. So this is not normally achieved because it's more difficult. The policy and governance working group doing some privacy work, some policy work, architecture over here, security over here. But the key is this thinking interoperability between the various aspects about the same thing. And usually we would not have that luxury of a common understanding of what we're talking about from different perspectives. And as a result, it's very difficult to cross-correlate the outcomes of these efforts, these separate siloed efforts. So starting with that cross-visibility is a key beginning perspective. Now, this is work out of the architecture working group, but it is very important because it feeds into the security and assurance working group. So in the architecture working group, there are these notions, ontology notions, that basically say that all digital currency types have these 5 notions. These will decompose into distinctions, and it grows very quickly. But the objective of these notions is to take, let's say, the input language of policy about digital currencies. So you see here DC type policy, and go through some kind of normalizer, communication normalizer that doesn't have, the negative effects of a lot of baggage to certain terms, and different input choices will specify architectural or technological characteristics. So this work is underway. It's going on very nicely, and I'll mention why it's important in a minute. And that is, we're doing validation. And therefore, we're doing validation of a system design onward. So we're not doing validation on notions. So we pick up where the architectural working group will provide its notions. So here are the 5 notions of digital currencies. They decompose into their primary distinctions. But we've discovered in doing this work that you first start with a supply of units. The unit gets value, ownership, value is owned, value is exchanged and recorded. The updated exchange of ownership is updated. So I'm not intent to show you this, but these distinctions further decompose and further decompose. So why am I mentioning this work output? Is that this will be the basis of building targets. This ontology reduces matters to its simplest form, from which we can now build cryptocurrency or CBDC targets. And they're articulated and built in a very careful way. So that's going to be very useful. So the work stream needs to then build a notion of a one digital currency type system, the thing that we have to validate. So we need to create sort of a value process and enabling value asset representation of what the digital currency type system is doing. We then need to identify and map vulnerabilities to potential threats so that we can easily conduct an impact analysis. We need to be able to map what are we going to do about it, security policies, and how are we going to mitigate those threat vectors and consider them specifically as it relates to the value assets being threatened so we can do some protection by design. We need to be able to measure different perspectives of the digital currency systems and its security controls, such as the efficacy of those controls. And we need to be able to measure them with increasing precision so that we have a common basis of valuation and benchmarking, as you very well know. So why do we need standards or standardization? And so why do we need DC³ and its function? We are in the middle of this technological innovation that is just the latest wave, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, even earlier stage, but now innovation cannot be stopped. ITU steps in and says, hey, we got to make sure we create some standards. We will, validate those standards as we're doing now. They'll eventually be sent to study group 17 and further massaged and eventually be issued as standards. And then organizations can comply. Usually this time may take a decade or so, but really time is money. And if we're trying to reduce the time, increase the confidence, reduce the cost so that it can be more profitable, then we're trying to shorten that time by having commonality built in by design up front. So I believe this is where we can have our first Vijay moment for comments. To you, Vijay.
Okay, thank you, Jacques. I don't see any questions from the audience so far in the Q&A, but maybe, I don't know, Ed, you would like to maybe add something maybe on what's happening at your level, and if you have any comments on what Jacques just mentioned before we move to the next part.
Yes, Jacques is describing a process and a validation process. It's important to start the thinking along this line, to take the business case, the authority, and the process in the thinking to move forward. As you know, that I'm representing ISO, and ISO has a process called common criteria that was developed actually years ago. But that the development there and the development now has some commonality, but at the same time, there are differences. The subject matter of digital currency obviously would be new. The common criteria was made for defense, was more broadly developed and created as a standard for the for use in different commercial as well as government applications. So as we proceed today, I'll be adding more depth to what ISO has, as well as what could be applicable to what Jacques is putting forward.
Ed, you mentioned, if I can just bounce off one of the things you're saying, common criteria, very well architected from the point of view of assurance level. But you mentioned that, oh, well, that's military systems. And so at some point in the conversation, we're going to ask the question of whether digital currency systems and their criticality should be similar to the military's consideration of its systems being critical. Right? It's a key point that we'll have to discuss in the sense of not only the application of security, but how much security, right? Assurance level. We'll get into that a little later.
Okay.
Thank you. Next topic.
So I think, yeah, please continue, Jacques. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, I guess that's the point I was making. I'll show some evidence in a moment that that's certainly not happening. And I'm sort of like heartbroken because I thought that people would consider digital currencies as a use case that, that can't go through that evolution of technological innovation where, security is considered last, function is considered, that's the normal way things are developed. But I would have thought that, oh, for this, we need to be careful. And so obviously that's what's going to be proposed. Now, let's take a look at the need for assurance. Now, a lot of the work that you'll see here will all be based and articulated on a notion of value and the movement of value. So we're going to talk about, yes, the financial inclusion, but at the end of the day, value creation, hopefully from the edges, and value consumption, hopefully at the edges, i.e. the intent is you don't have to move to centralized areas, nor a lot of individuals don't have the luxury of moving. They need to either create or consume where they are. Now, the digital currency world will be the lubricant for that, creation and consumption. And if that lubricant is not trustworthy, then we'll have challenges. And here I say value exchange for currencies with loss. I would ask, is this just like a credit card and losses will be built in, indemnified, warranted, and we'll just call it the cost of doing business? Or if that's the case, will that just destroy the trust needed for the fourth industrial revolution to happen? So basically, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential in front of us. Some would say a lot of disruption in relation to value creation, value consumption, and this cryptocurrency world. So this promise of financial inclusion, where you're transferring funds to consumption, transferring that value, and on the way back, transacting that value. So there's compensation flowing. So basically, if that can be permitted to occur wherever you are frictionlessly, then where there is value, there will be an attempt to steal value. And at this point, in relation to digital currencies, it's literally the wild, wild west. And that's just a normal evolution of innovation, much faster than our ability to even understand per se what's going on, secure it, even legislate it, regulate it. But any innovation goes through this wild, wild west. And depending on how wild it is, more or less confidence will be lost. Let me show you an example. So as of today, which is January 24th, there's been 54 hacking events for approximately 2.4 billion of cryptocurrency exchanges. You see here one Mt. Goth hack, 661 million stolen funds. That's a good day's work. And so you see, over a period of 10 years, 2.4 billion loss over 54 hacks. Now, if we go to DeFi, then, and we look at breaches, we'll see that, as I mentioned, initially 54 valued at 2.4 billion and 75 versus 1.7 billion. So more hacks worth more in 20% of the time. So we're looking at an exploding business with exponential damages occurring. The DeFi breaches are more in 1/5 the time. So you can get that information here. So that's an example of the fact that we've already, in essence, passed that point and of having to dig ourselves out of a hole with this notion of security inclusion now, if it's going to enable the financial inclusion. And so does that mean security by design? Not necessarily. So basically, if we come down to the building blocks of the need for assurance, we have here this notion that I've created value and I want to purchase value. So the individual or the identity is obviously core to being able to get remunerated for value creation. So you have here the traditional identification attributes of identify yourself or prove control over the digital currency. So how will you exercise your rights as I? At the end of the day, again, from a point of view of value, your I is what value did you create or what value did you purchase? So the whole notion of what and the authenticity of what through various cryptographic techniques, which Ed would be very familiar with, whether it be the immutability of the blockchain today or other mechanisms, trust creating mechanisms that cryptography can enable. So that's more on the information, obviously cryptographic asymmetric for identification as well. But it's organized around I own, I've created. So you can see that I want to get paid for the value created. I'm willing to pay for value that somebody else created. What is that exactly? Once I buy it, how can I prove it's still, valuable? And then at the end, as I mentioned, digital currency types at their core are fundamentally about ownership of value. And with the confidence that you own value, then you can transact away, even in the DeFi case where there's no centralization or intermediaries, and still have assurance of these different business characteristics of I need trust, I need clear liability lines, and knowledge of any warranties that are managing or indemnifying some of the liability. These business attributes don't really change. And so and so that you can own with confidence. Any sort of weakness in this would give you weakness in your proof of ownership and therefore hamper your ability to transact away. So at this point, just another pause around the notion of digital currencies, maybe even the word liability, and how that's managed. But opening it up, Vijay, to you.
Yeah, okay, Jacques, thank you. I don't see any question, but I have a question for you before I give the floor to Ed. Maybe if you could elaborate a bit, what do you mean by assurance? Is there a definition for
Yeah.
assurance in this for digital currency? What exactly that
Well, there
means?
wouldn't be for digital currency because assurance is assurance, independent of what you're trying to gain confidence of. So it's another word for how sure do I know I am protected? So it's a degree of confidence in the answer. So you measure something, you get an outcome, and then you may ask, well, how'd you get that outcome? And, oh, I guessed it. That's obviously very low assurance. Or the outcome was tested, verified, retested, and here's the outcome. And the certainty of that outcome is very high.
Okay.
So certainty and confidence are synonyms.
Okay, thank you. And if we maybe consider maybe what you are going to recommend here, maybe what is it, what is the thinking here? Is it something along the lines like what we have for, and at the level of the EU, maybe EIDAS, for example, where you have these different levels, or you have your own levels that you're maybe going to present?
You're referring to assurance levels?
Yes.
The whole topic of assurance level is a hot potato topic.
Okay.
Ed mentioned common criteria, and in the military use case, the funds are available for that level of verification and certification. And so how do we bring forth that notion, or do we, or can we, that we need a little more certainty? If people are going to put their value in this form, what is the level of confidence and certainty that they will not lose that, especially as a result of somebody's mistake or something? But so the question here, maybe to Ed again, it seems like digital currencies are just no different than anything else, than any other financial process. And in the financial processes, you know, in credit card financial processing, there's a cost of doing business. Is that something that is simply going to have to be true for digital currencies? There'll be, you know, at the end of the year, over time, losses by digital currency types, and people will put their money where, you know, the most secure version of the currency. So I'll give it back to you, Vijay.
Yeah, so maybe let's hear from Ed, maybe. What's the thinking at the level of ISO on this?
Well, there has been a lot of discussion on the subject. The point here is also focusing on the digital currency as the business case, as the reference that we need to add security to. As Jacques was just saying, assurance is a level of guarantee that the security methodology that has been chosen will perform according to some authority. We have the digital currency and their relationship to central authorities, and it can be visualized that the central authorities are going to also pull in the policy and the other factors that define or can define what assurance is, or validation is needed as such. So you have a method that includes the decisions by governments, decisions by the citizens, since they are going to be included as part of the digital currency usages. So the point that Jacques is raising now is also saying what value, not necessarily monetary wise, but what value do people put on their currency or their use of currencies? And now in this case, we're moving to digital currency, or currencies represented in a digital format. And does this raise the bar in regards to security? Since Jacques mentioned a whole lot of cyber attacks and things of that nature, which could be directly related to digital formats. So we are working toward a currency or a digital currency being defined that must take into account these risks, these potential flaws, and have the ability to add new technology or innovations from a security perspective based on the business case or what is desired to take place.
So Ed, you mentioned the word authority a moment ago. And back to my wild, wild west use case, I think it's the authorities that are missing, right? There is no, I mean, standard development organizations are not authorities. I hope you agree with that, in the sense that that's a should, right? Standards produce things that you should do. Authorities change the should to shall do. And so right now, it's almost like there are no grown-ups in the room. We don't have any people mandating shalls in terms of security level, because we're just starting to try to figure out what it should be, let alone shall.
Good point. However, we do have regulatory authority, the regulations and the guidance and the requirements, the shells that come with banking and with existing systems. That must also be included in the decisions.
Okay. And so when you were talking, I was thinking these new startups in the business how do they value security? Probably in the same way as any startup values security, and that's certainly on a secondary basis. Or certainly when something happens to a particular digital currency type, some of it's been stolen. There's a run out of that digital currency type to somewhere else, right? So confidence, and the friction to convert is very low. You can get some very rapid swings in value of currency based on whether people perceive their value to be safe or not. So thank you. Let me continue.
Yes.
Now we're going to move. Yes, go ahead.
So yes, Jacques, just to let you know, we are a bit behind time, so if
okay.
you can speed
All
up
right,
maybe
thank
on
you.
the others. Thanks.
So the state of global protection. So here I'm going to sort of describe the big problem. So if we looked at 2018, which is obviously pre-pandemic, this was the size, $86 trillion global wealth, internet connected 4.5 billion people out of 7.7 for a 60% penetration. So clearly that's a nice, huge, juicy target of that amount of economy creation and individuals that can be exploited to get to that value. And then we all know that cyber risk is pretty up there in the global risks. And here's a measure of how we are protected. In fact, there's an updated version of this report, so I have to see how things have improved. But back then, about a third of the people think they're protected, and 2/3 of the rest of the world are underprotected with 45 no protection. So you're seeing the dark blue here, no protection, underprotected, and the advanced countries who think they're protected, and they spend some $300 billion in thinking they're protected. And when you look at the expenditures, therefore, about a third of the people who think they're protected spend about 80% of the budget, or $240 billion, on protecting themselves. The rest of the world gets 20%, or 60 billion, to protect itself. So that's a snapshot of the state of global protection in 2018, with 2/3 of the world rapidly connecting to the 1/3 of the world in this highly distributed, decentralized, everything's connected to everything world. So it's like a major problem where the business and the innovation is moving ahead. People are connecting into the collective, and it's happening whether you're secured or not. The next thing to realize is, if you look at the demand for security, skills, and expertise versus time, we all know that there's a mass shortage of skills versus the availability of skills. And in my opinion, as of now, we are in a state of unsustainable divergence, meaning that the problem will never be reversed, such that at some point in time we could get ahead of the curve. So you may ask yourself, what do I do to bend the curve? So it can't be insignificant. These are bend the curve things. So, okay, I'm sure that if we share some threat intelligence and we do things secure by design, and we do better education, and that's training, by the way. That's not, don't click on that link. Security automation, yes, that would help to bend the curve in. But we have this fiduciary awakening going on. I thought it was kind of over a few years ago. It's been going on for quite a while, where the executive gets hacked and then says, holy something, and then, oh, I need a CISO, oh, I need a 10, 20 people. And all of a sudden they're awakening, and they're creating an increased demand because they've been somewhat sleeping at the wheel. So all these things, including security training of employees not to click on the link, we'll have to, more things will have to come into play in order to get ahead of this curve. And what is being presented today can bend both the demand curve and supply curve in hopefully a way where at some point we can get ahead of the problem. The only problem is, on average, with the number of people entering security space who are unskilled, the average skilled level is going down. And we all know that threat severity is not linear, it's an exponential growth. So, so the real picture is a little worse. But that's the state of global protection. This is where I can pause here. The point is, can we ever get ahead of the curve? Because, the innovators are innovating and putting these systems online, they're available. The 2/3 of the world, or those who are still remain unconnected, will get connected. They'll use these services. The financial inclusion will occur. But at what loss, damages, reputational to the business? And so, what is it we can do to get ahead of the curve? Any other questions at this point, or Ed or Vijay? It's all yours.
Yeah, maybe Ed, some thoughts from your side on this, on the questions raised by Jacques here.
Well, Jacques bringing up the point of what is the state of what could be taking place in the international community regarding security. And what we are asking here is there a balance that can be reached, in the sense that we also have the growth of the business case, or the growth of wanting to move to a digital representation for this type of banking capability. Now, we have tools that are part of the supply, as Jacques has identified. It's how we can use these tools, and the idea or the effort that we are talking about today is to put these tools into a process that can facilitate things. The process can give us an advantage on time to delivery, where if we just take the education level, we may not have time to deliver on your side. So understanding the various factors that can go into to what extent security is needed, to what extent do we have tools to address those needs, becomes important and part of the discussion today.
So Ed, this is the global problem, and between ITU and ISO, I think from an SDO, Standards Development Organization, we cover, I don't know what percent of the landscape. So clearly, the only way we can get ahead of the curve is really if we think unified, that right up front, just like we're trying to do with this common, consistent, comparable, are we at the very early stages normalizing or trying to leverage each other so that the outcome between ISO and ITU being aligned, not overlapping, these sessions that ensure that we complement each other. But I'm just realizing that the play that can get ahead of the curve has to be a united front, because even the ISO ITU silos are producing standard specifications, a really unified, common, consistent approach between the both organizations as represented by the both of us, would be a necessary but insufficient requirement. And I don't know what are the other sufficient things, but if we don't cooperate and come out sort of unified, then we're not getting ahead of the curve, I guess is what I'm saying. So hopefully our liaison will be very productive. Any other comments?
No, I think you can continue, Jacques.
Okay, some operational challenges. So you have this word assurance, and it's like it's something different than security. It isn't. You're going to be putting in a certain amount of security. And we're talking about what is your confidence level in the efficacy of those controls in mitigating threats. So you're still needing information about what you need to do. You're needing information about what has actually been done. And there's a whole communication cycle that's going on continually. So if we don't solve some of the operational challenges, then we will not be able to keep up with the innovation. Now this starts coming back to the frictions involved in conducting security on a daily basis in a world of security control, information overflow. But basically, if we have this dream, the CISO is sleeping and they're dreaming, nirvana, that when they wake up tomorrow morning and the executive asks them a question, are we, the CISO doesn't understand why it always feels hot when I get a question like that. They're in the kitchen. So the CISO has to whisk off and look inward at the actual control implementation state. And in this dream world has this crystal ball. Just can get up at 8:55, look into crystal ball and get the answer 5 minutes later. But that's visibility on the actual control implementation. That's protocol specific, environment specific. And it's a different world than the world that the executive chief information security officer has to communicate back. And so usually you have to respond based on the state of control that you just saw in your crystal ball. But then how does that, it gets responded in the context of this state, but the response is also based on the question. Are we compliant? Are we this? Are we that? You have to have the response. So there's a huge amount of friction causing billions of dollars of expenditures by every organization simply trying to go up and down between actual, communicate in the objective framework world. There's no direct connection here until now. And translating the response in the context of the question and the state is a very painful process. So we can't expect organizations to apply security, let alone, verify its assurance level, because your use case and your business case warrants that level of assurance. Otherwise, you're going to be in the news. So the problem, the operational problem is really an information overflow problem. And it's odd for me to say that, but because ISO and ITU produce what I'm saying is part of the problem, that doesn't seem very good. But basically, there's an awful lot of organizations, whether it be standards or regulators, authorities we spoke about earlier, or certifications or industry associations in the US and globally. There's just a huge amount of information about so little. although there's a lot of security that one needs to know. So you're struggling, you're saying, where does this all go? You know, you have this bowl of spaghetti, and you're kind of left on your own to figure it out. Kind of getting to it doesn't seem that difficult, but what does it all mean? And you know, things like, is it complete? Is it correct? You know, if there's so many different documents explaining the same thing, there's an issue of correctness. So at the end of the day, you know, you want to find out how to do something. And unfortunately, the number one tool today are spreadsheets, because frameworks are created in them, gap analyses are conducted in them. Regulators send you the frameworks in them. Actually, they don't, but that's your first step, to put them in Excel. But Excel itself is a tomb, right? There are fundamental operational issues of why we cannot use Excel, any framework in any spreadsheet. And it's because it's a one-to-many construct. It says that here's my security control framework, and you see that fixed reference, and I'm going to tell you through a series of hundreds of controls what you should do. And that is the view of the world as defined by the author of the framework. And they're going to be really, really nice to you, and they're going to give you some maps. And they're going to say that control is equivalent, related to this other control. But they're just going to give you the ID. You have to go find it, find the document, open the document. I mean, forget it. And you have this one-way external mapping. Now, if the industry is stuck in this tool, it's a problem. We have to have a construct that is not one-to-many, but many-to-many. Here's the example of the Cyber Risk Institute framework as defined on the left, and then you see all their controls over here. And this is that very nice of them to give you some CSV v11.
Sorry, Jacques, I'll ask you to wrap up this part.
Okay, sure. So the point being is that there is a platform at DCGI that allows you to select any reference, select any map2 reference, can show you the description side by side. That can't be done in a spreadsheet. Show you the same mapped framework, the controls, and then at the bottom here, show how that control validates any number of other controls. So clearly, there is a need for the friction to be removed out of the system so that one can do security. Now, this work has been awarded a best paper award, 3rd place, and in it says that the tool will be made available to the world. So I still have to actually do that. This is the pause, Vijay, on operational challenges. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Jacques. Maybe Ed, very quickly, maybe any insights maybe from ISO on this?
Sure, it's not only ISO, but it's looking at the community, the financial community itself also. We have to consider the consumer is going to be the consumption person in this effort, since the digital currency will eventually go through the process, but wind up on the consumer's phone or PC. And now what is being discussed is the ways of looking at security to that consumer or to an organization as such. In other words, it has to be simplified so that the consumer doesn't have to know how the response was done, but has to be able to relate to the response in their own environment. So,
Right.
another thought.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. So Jacques, maybe over to you for the next part.
Thank you. Evolution by consensus. So in order for us to make progress, so this is kind of the time, do we need to rethink security? That's, yes, we need a tool that allows me to travel and navigate without friction to anywhere, any framework, change, reference, anchor on demand, and so on. So I need a tool that makes it easy for me to get to the information I need to see. The other problem is the information that you will see is in written form. And so you take this new model and you ask yourself the following question. Oh, security is this delivered property, and protection is this received property. Now, security can be performing what they perceive to be perfectly good security from a system design. That system is operating according to design, but it may be delivering very little protection per se. So if you make an assumption, it will lead to the ability to model something a little differently. But here's an example very quickly. So in a security control, you'll have a description of the security value that they want you to impart on some business value. So ensure the integrity, confidentiality of data, motion, and at rest and in use. So even though this is kind of a control statement, it's huge, the things that you will have to do to achieve that. But if you say, okay, well, I'm not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. In fact, I'm going to assume that they're not the same. And so security delivered is by an asset, and that asset can be any people, process, or technology. And we don't know if it's effective to mitigating the threat that is being exercised on the target, the business asset. The business asset is just people, process, and technology generating business value. So we're making that assumption that they're not the same. And so the work that you're about to see has already a fairly long history. There is a unified security model, and it's also incorporated in the ITU focus group in protection assurance for digital currencies. So it's kind of in the security manual, and its thinking is already embedded in two X recommendations in the annex, which are non-normative, and basically that paper award and basically a platform that we're using now based on the model to now do some validation. Now, I'm quickly going to go through the new model. And if you can take a moment to put aside your notions of security, because security evolved by consensus over time. It didn't get created from a clean slate. And at the end of the day, a clean slate is what I started from. So if you go to a universe far, far away, in fact, where there's nothing, and then there's a value creation force that is born. In the Internet of Value, there's the value creation force. Where there is value, there is risk. It's just human nature. So you have this influence between two forces where value creation is threatened by value risk, or risk threatens creation. They're bidirectional. And because there is risk or loss to value, the owner of the value will invest in its preservation. So a value preservation force is born. And it has a relationship to value in that it protects it. And then whoever owns the value and is investing in its preservation will also want to make sure that the preservation is in fact effective in mitigating against the loss. And so you'll have the preservation force being validated by the assurance force. So at this point in the universe, there's only four things going on. There's good, creation of value. There's bad, theft of value. I'm going to preserve value. You know, $1 of value preserved is $1 value created. And then there's an assurance force just to make sure that it's preserved. So at this point, there's a four-force model, digital force. Now, what happens is all those forces one morning give birth, explode, and give birth to their actors. So instead of four forces, all of them explode and they give birth to billions of value asset actors and value process actors, billions of threat vectors, little nasty guys, you know, billions of internal controls and security assets that deliver security mechanisms. And the assurance force gave birth to all the external controls in the universe. So now we merge away from four forces to billions and billions of these actors, and they're all imprinted with their DNA, meaning a threat vector life is to attack value assets. So that's wired into their DNA. That's all they do. Now, if you're an organization, you have full control over value assets and how they enable value processes, and you have full control how you preserve your value. This is your security budget. But you really have no control about the external threat vectors or external compliance. So, you know, you're having to manage against these, and these are your variables you can fully manage. And so those six actors that derive from four forces, they only engage in five relationships. As I said, a value asset in the universe only knows how to enable value processes, and threat vectors in the universe only know how to threaten value asset vulnerabilities. And internal controls are policy statements about how you will protect this value asset, given what it's doing and how it is being threatened. And then you will then have actors that will get super excited about how to actually meet every requirement in this internal control. For example, confidentiality of data. That's a lot of mechanisms onto a lot of assets that you need to put in place to fulfill that. And then at the end of the day, you know, how does that get demonstrated to the external control actor? So they really, that's the model. That's the security control expression. This model has the property that it can describe any scenario of security in the universe, and therefore all of security is reduced to six actors and five relationships. So what we've done is we've replaced this world of a lot of words, and you have to decompose and figure out what's the target, what are they asking for, by an expression which is, you know, syntactically isolates the issue of threat to, enabling of, and so on, right? So, you know, and you know exactly the relationship. So I'm trying to move forward here. So now we're going, you know, from a state of spaghetti to a state where we've removed a lot of the unnecessary wording, and we've created relational structures that are consistent right and left. And as we create and record these relational structures, they are in fact knowledge that remains persistent in those expressions. So this is the next pause point, Vijay, to you. So the point here is about a new model, sort of started from scratch. versus a lot of old established models that still exist in ISO, in ITU. And that maybe brings up the question of a time to retrofit some of those models that were thought of 20 years ago. Ed, to you.
Yeah, maybe Ed, yeah, can we have your
Sorry,
views
Vijay.
on this?
Well, we talking of really a broad subject here, but condensing it, I think, again, sort of reinforcing what was pointed out a few minutes ago. I think the experience from ISO and the experience as well as the developments from ITU can address the subject of digital currency, as well as it relates to the central authorities. The mechanics of doing this, with given the potential for collaboration, may be that what aspects are identified in the approach that Jacques is just now talking about, as well as what has existed, maybe also another direction for the committee to consider.
Thank
See,
you,
the
Ed.
new approach, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think, yeah, that's a good suggestion. I think we already have a liaison, but I think if we can work together, I mean, DC³, and also the at the level of ISO, collaborate together on this, we might come up with maybe something completely new that might be useful for this.
Agree. The new approach, as I'm sort of articulating it, is, you know, what is the stepping function here? The new approach, I think, is a big that we need to cross, right? And we're in a world of having to select a framework, 1, 2, 3 that are in scope, because they're given to us, they're mandated to us. What the new approach needs to eliminate the dependence that is created when a single framework is adopted, and have a tool that allows you to see all security control frameworks as simply part of security body of knowledge, and to use any one of them in any way that you see fit to create the one that you need that is customized and optimized to your target. So that's that new approach, is, you know, is not having to select which framework to take. But again, if you're mandated, you don't have a choice. So I kind of call that the you know, the battle of the frameworks. We're still in an era where industry associations are battling it out to be the framework. Pick me. And the point is, let's pick them all. All right.
Okay, Jacques, so just for your information, we have 15 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you maybe if you can maybe very quickly over the next 10 minutes, maybe complete the rest of your presentation.
Absolutely. Let me just take a quick look here.
And then we'll do a final pause and conclude the session.
Thank you, Vijay. I'm going to quickly jump here. So we're talking assurance. And so we're talking a need for formality. So you asked about what is the definition of assurance. Well, you won't get it through, you know, things being loose, right? So it's in the formality. How do we know for sure? And again, that sureness is a level that every vulnerability, of every value asset, of every value process in one digital system has been treated. Now, this has nothing to do with the kind of treatment. It can be a very poor treatment. That's another topic. But I need formality in understanding what are the vulnerabilities, and have I gone through them systematically to address them systematically. And if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, the person can come and continue and know exactly the scope of vulnerabilities in the system, and it's no longer dependent on the person doing the work. which is another very strong upside, is that in security, people leave all the time. If you can institutionalize the security knowledge they have about the organization, it doesn't matter if they leave as much. So here, how do we know? And so you remember the model, and that model is true for one vulnerability. So that's a very important thing. For one vulnerability, performing this value process, so you get a sense of criticality, data sensitivity in this digital system. How can it be threatened? What should I do about it? How am I going to actually do it? And how am I going to prove it? So that is always the same for every vulnerability. So here I can treat this vulnerability. And then when I aggregate across all vulnerabilities, then I get what I would call a value asset attack profile, surface profile. And then if I iterate over all value assets in one value process, I end up getting a value process attack surface. If I then iterate over all value processes, I will now have a digital system attack surface. So this nested iterative process allows you to serve up in reverse, if you will, every vulnerability of every value asset in every value process, making one digital system. So, okay, so here, the tool will allow you to pull out a digital system, a digital currency system, have in it its value processes, and the different value processes are stored in the value process repository of that digital system. And value processes can be decomposed until you get small enough that you can identify the enabling value asset. And then you store all those enabling value asset for that value process in the value process value asset attack surface. So you're basically just recording, you did it in reverse. So you iterated and you recorded, okay, you went through every value asset of every value process, and you said, oh, okay, it's a structured database. Oh, the text is in plain, I should encrypt it. I should put some access control, two-factor authentication on that database, and I should monitor the behavior of that database. So there's lots of things you can do, but but after you have knowledge of the thing that is being attacked, so that you can look systematically at how each vulnerability can be exploited. And then when you've done that, when the deep subject matter threat experts looked at every vulnerability in every value asset of every value process, they're storing the applicable threats in another framework. So at this point, you know your target quite precisely, you know how it can be exploited, and we can start the treatment process. At this point, this is the staging point before I finish about this particular point, the need for formality and how that formality gets translated into a tool that exercises that formality. Vijay, all yours.
Yeah, so Jacques, like I said, maybe let's complete all your slides and then we'll come back to questions. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that then. Really, we're in summary, but if we take the common criteria that Ed mentioned earlier that comes from ISO, you'll get these increasing levels of assurance. But what I'm trying to point out here is what is changing, and it's the formality of, or not the formality and the robustness of the verification method, functionally tested, structurally tested. And so you're just, the formality of the testing procedure and even the method of testing is documented, right? So as you increase here, it's just a lot more effort in verification. And the tool that I mentioned provides you with that capability by being able to increase the precision in measurement. Obviously, precision in measurement gives you assurance, not insurance. And really, what is different with the proposed method here is that we know a lot about the target. In fact, we start with defining the target as a target, the thing that we're protecting as a target, and then we do threat 2, and then we do, so that's not usually the normal way, but we're trying to shift away from what I would call notional security, which external frameworks that were written with no knowledge of your target must be, to precision security, which is based on knowing exactly your value asset types. So on that note, this is our progress as it relates to our goal. Certainly would ask for any individual with any interest, whether on the policy side, the architecture side, or the validation side, to please help us. This is work in progress, and it'll only get better through multiple contributions. That's it for me, Vijay.
Okay, thank you very much, Jacques, for the presentation. So maybe now maybe we can take maybe it's some comments from Ed, you know, on the common criteria part. You know, the slide where you had this, maybe some insights from you here, Ed. Is there any thoughts on your side or at the level of ISO for applying this also to digital currencies?
Well, in short, it turns out that I did one of these, and
okay.
it's years ago now. It's not recent, and it wasn't digital currency, but it was a communication system. And the kinds of questions that came up were very similar to what we presented today. What authority are you going to accept the model, as well as the what type of target and all the necessary capabilities that would exist. And then you put the security levels. And as you see here, in the case of common criteria, there are 7 levels, but there's also a cost and time that go with each of these levels. And so you put that in the business model of for security, what can be done, what's realistic, what is available, how much is it automated, as opposed to something that you have to create. The terminologies are similar.
Do you think that,
yes.
Well, when in the military world, you're kind of given the money to be this assured, right? The buyer pays for that level of assurance. We don't have that in the digital currency world. Nobody is going to pay this money except the company itself. So not only are we, and maybe even the consumer buy side on the currency side could sustain the cost of this. So, you know, there's a complexity component. It's not easy to do. It's very costly. And since we're very early stage in the innovation cycle, it's all about functionality. So if we're saying we want this, or if somebody's going to mandate this, but I don't think anyone's close to mandating any assurance level. You remember our past conversations when we said, well, you said, we'll get everyone to agree to assurance level 0. Why? Everyone can agree. Or maybe like 1, right? We can agree at the lowest level of assurance, can we not? And so we can get agreement on that. And then the difficulty is, can we get agreement on 2? And then all of a sudden, you know, reality sinks in, costs and market dynamics sink in. But you could see for the CBDC world, you know, central bank issued currency, that they would take more due care Sorry, go ahead. Right, it's a due care. What is the due care responsibility of that cryptocurrency operator?
You got a lot of factors that have to be considered here.
Right.
We can be talking about cryptocurrencies. We also could be talking about fiat and how what relationship between these two entities could be acceptable. And then from that relationship, a distributive cost model could come out of that. But there is a cost, as well as how do you, it still is in the discussion stage on the question of money and the question of digital representation of money. And then the application of money comes to play, and sort of as we are just talking about. I'm looking at the EAL levels can be assigned to that application, but it also could be assigned to money. And so I think in regards to the CBDC itself, we still defining how should that be viewed in the business case.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe Jacques and Ed, maybe let's take a couple of questions from the Q&A now. So
Sure.
there's a question for you, Jacques, here on the implementation aspect. What are your thoughts on which of the EAL levels exist on the client side, like for example, an app, and which ones on the blockchain or server or cloud?
Yeah, I'm not aware of much common criteria activity going on in any
Maybe Ed?
digital currency system.
Yeah, to my knowledge at the moment,
Yeah.
I don't believe anyone has submitted a actual target as such.
Okay. And then there's another question, is how do you see the assurance level for CBDCs in front of quantum technology?
Yeah, quantum is definitely a game changer, obviously. And when is it going to happen? But clearly, and we have a specialist, Paul Lloyd, in our working group specialized in this, but clearly any design must be taking that aspect into consideration because it is not far away. And of course, as soon as the capability is available, then a lot of the assumed protections evaporate. That will be a weakness that, of course, will be exploited at the speed of light. And therefore, any amount of time in that exposed state could be devastating to the company. So you need to certainly, for 10 years out, start thinking about swapping out some of the algorithms appropriately. That's on quantum. And there's a lot of activity in that area. But quantum is sort of all of a sudden the algorithms we thought that were giving us protection don't. Now so the EAL, somewhat a separate perspective. The algorithms that'll come out with the new algorithms will be quote tested to, to some level, because those algorithms being produced by NIST and others will be heavily formally tested. That's a good question to see to what level. But if you're doing an algorithm protocol, you're probably doing something fairly high, right? Because to have a 0 day on something like that would be devastating.
Okay,
So,
I think we've come a bit to the end of the session. We're already
Mhm.
past half past 5 here.
All right.
So maybe just to quickly summarize. So we've seen a bit, what are the issues regarding, how you would protect your digital currency systems. And I think Jacques mentioned, the new model that he's thinking about, and how we can also think about, assurance levels for digital currencies. And this is a work that is still in progress at the level of the Digital Currency Global Initiative. So, and since, the ISO is also, having thoughts on this, so maybe like a collaboration, like we already have a liaison with ISO, so maybe some more stronger collaboration going forward, like joint meetings maybe could be
Great idea.
considered, and so that we can share, both sides, how we move forward in this particular area, and hopefully we'll have something to share maybe at the second edition of the DC³ conference later, either this year or next year. So with these thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of the session today. Again, I would like to thank both our panelists for their participation today and for sharing their insights on the topic. So we've come to the end also of the DC³ conference today, and I would like to thank everyone who have, attended all the different sessions that we had over the past 3 days. And with this, I'd like to, thank you for your
Thank you.
participation and declare the session closed as well as the conference. Thank you and have
Thank
a
you so
nice
much for your
day,
time.
everyone.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.